Winter in New England can be brutal, especially during a storm. That night, as I drove along the winding roads blanketed in snow, the wipers of my old Subaru fighting a losing battle against the freezing sleet, I realized I wouldn't make it to Liam's place. We planned to spend the weekend together, but as the sky darkened and the storm grew more violent, it was clear I'd need to stop. The snow was coming down so fast I could hardly see more than a few feet ahead, and every mile brought a new patch of ice threatening to spin me off the road. My phone's GPS was useless, constantly recalculating as the signal wavered in and out. That's when I saw it, a small diner just off the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly through the snow. It seemed like an oasis of warmth and light in the middle of a white desert. I pulled in, the wheels of my car crunching over the icy gravel, and parked beside a beat-up truck that looked like it hadn't moved in days. Inside the diner, the warmth hit me first, then the smell, greasy food and stale coffee, with a faint undertone of cigarette smoke. There were only two other people inside, a grizzled older man in a thick plaid jacket hunched over a plate of fries, and a guy maybe a few years older than me sitting at the counter. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair peeking out from under a beanie, and he looked like someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He caught my eye and smiled, a little too eagerly. I ordered a coffee, and before I could even think about asking where I might find a place to stay for the night, the guy at the counter, Toby, he introduced himself, was already offering suggestions. "You won't make it much further in this weather," he said, gesturing outside at the blizzard that was now in full swing. "There's a little motel just a mile down the road. Nothing fancy, but they've got heat and clean rooms. I'm headed that way myself." I hesitated. Something about his friendliness struck me as odd, too forward. But when I glanced back at the window, where the snow was swirling in angry gusts, the idea of pushing on any further seemed reckless. Plus, I figured, it was just a recommendation. I could make my own decision once I got there. "Thanks," I mumbled, sipping my coffee. "I'll check it out." Toby didn't leave right away. He sat with me for another few minutes, chatting about the storm, where I was from, where I was headed. I kept my answers short, not offering much. The whole conversation felt a bit off, like he was fishing for information, but maybe I was just being paranoid. When I stood to leave, Toby finally got up too. "See you at the motel," he said with another smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't reply. The snow had already piled up over my car's tires by the time I left the diner, and it took a few nerve-wracking attempts to get the engine going. Following Toby's truck was easy enough. The road was empty except for us, and his taillights glowed like faint beacons in the snow. A few minutes later, we pulled into the lot of the motel he'd mentioned. It was one of those places that looked like it had seen better days, the kind where the paint on the sign is peeling and the lobby smells like mold. But it was shelter, and at that point, that was all I cared about. I parked my car and walked inside. The man behind the front desk was thin and tired-looking, his face drawn with lines that made him appear older than he probably was. He glanced at me without much interest as I asked for a room. "Single or double?" he asked, his voice rough. "Single, please." The room he gave me was on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot. The walls were thin, and the heater rattled in the corner like it might give up at any moment, but at least it was warm. I was about to take off my coat when I noticed something strange. Across the parking lot, parked just a few spaces away from where I left my car, was an old sedan, its windows fogged up from the cold. I didn't remember seeing it there when I arrived. Then I heard the noise, a faint rustling sound coming from the bathroom. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it was more than that. Someone was in there. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Who the hell could be in my room? I hadn't even been here long enough for anyone to follow me. Slowly, I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the bathroom. The rustling stopped, but I wasn't about to stick around to see who, or what, was in there. I bolted. I ran down the stairs, nearly slipping on the icy steps, and rushed to the front desk. The man was still there, looking as disinterested as before, like he'd seen it all 100 times. There's someone in my room! I gasped, out of breath. In the bathroom! The man blinked slowly. For a second, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he sighed, reached for the phone, and dialed a number. But instead of calling the police, he muttered something into the receiver, something too low for me to hear clearly. A few minutes later, I saw Toby's truck pulling out of the lot. I watched as it disappeared into the night, my mind racing. Why had he left so suddenly? And why didn't the motel worker seem concerned? Don't worry, the front desk guy said, finally hanging up the phone. I'll give you another room. You'll be fine. I didn't feel fine. But what choice did I have? The storm outside had turned into a full-blown blizzard, and there was no way I could drive in that. Reluctantly, I took the new room key and headed upstairs again, trying to shake the sense of unease that clung to me like the cold. The second room was much like the first, basic, with the same rattling heater and thin walls. But this time, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Still, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. Something wasn't right about this place. Something wasn't right about Toby, or the man at the front desk. I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I woke up with a start, disoriented. The pale morning light filtering through the thin motel curtains barely lifted the oppressive gloom that still hung in the air. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. My pulse quickened, and I glanced toward the bathroom door, half expecting to hear those same unsettling noises again. But all was silent. I pushed myself out of bed, shivering as my feet touched the cold linoleum floor. My phone was dead, and I silently cursed myself for not plugging it in the night before. I needed to get out of here, but the blizzard from last night still raged, the wind howling against the windows. It seemed the storm wasn't going to give up anytime soon. I quickly dressed, my movements rushed and nervous. The memory of Toby's sudden departure, the motel worker's strange call, and that car in the parking lot weighed on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I was about to grab my keys and make a break for it, blizzard be damned, when curiosity got the better of me. I hadn't imagined those sounds coming from the bathroom. And I hadn't imagined that car appearing out of nowhere. But the question nagging at the back of my mind was, why? Who was in my room last night, and why hadn't the motel worker seemed alarmed? I approached the bathroom door, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew it was probably a bad idea, but I had to know. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, everything seemed normal. The small, dingy bathroom looked just as it had when I first entered the room. Grimy tiles, a rusty sink, a cracked mirror. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. Behind the shower curtain, peeking out from the corner of the tub, was a piece of cloth, dark, soaked, and crumpled like it had been hastily shoved there. My stomach twisted. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before pulling the curtain back fully. There, lying in the bottom of the tub, was a shirt. It was drenched in something dark and sticky, something that looked an awful lot like blood. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, my hand trembling as I let the curtain fall back into place. What the hell was this? Suddenly, I couldn't stay there another second. Grabbing my things, I practically ran out of the room and down the stairs, heading straight for the front desk. But when I got there, the man from last night was gone. In his place was a woman, older, her face kind but worn. She greeted me with a smile that felt out of place given the circumstances. "Leaving already, Han?" she asked, her tone friendly. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the edge of panic creeping in. "Where's the guy who was here last night? The one who gave me my room?" The woman frowned, confusion crossing her face. "Guy? Sweetie, I've been working the desk all night. No one else has been here. You must be mistaken." My blood ran cold. "No, there was a man, older, thin. He gave me my key when I checked in." The woman shook her head, still smiling, but now it looked more like pity. "You must be tired. It was just me, all night. I felt dizzy, like I was caught in some kind of surreal dream. But the noises in the room last night, there was someone in the bathroom, and I stopped myself. There was no point in explaining. She was looking at me like I was crazy. I didn't have time for this. All I wanted to do was get out of this place. I handed her the key without another word and rushed out the door into the biting cold. The snow was piled high, and the wind was still fierce, but I didn't care. I just needed to be away from that motel, away from whatever strange game was being played there. As I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock my car door with frozen fingers, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. The old sedan from last night was gone. It didn't make any sense. No car could have left in the middle of that storm without me hearing it. And yet, it was like the car had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. Had I imagined it? Had the whole night been some kind of fever dream brought on by exhaustion and fear? I didn't want to find out. I needed to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment, then roared to life, cutting through the eerie silence of the parking lot. As I backed out, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, someone standing in the doorway of the motel, watching me. It wasn't the woman from the front desk. It was Toby. My hands clenched the steering wheel as I sped out of the lot, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was going on? Why was he still there? He'd left last night, hadn't he? I could still see his truck pulling out of the lot, his taillights disappearing into the snow. But then I remembered the blood-stained shirt in the bathroom. Had something happened after he left? Or had he never left at all? I drove as fast as I could without sliding off the road, the storm still raging all around me. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away, on the main highway, the motel and its secrets fading into the rearview mirror. By the time I reached Liam's place, the storm had died down, and the sky was a dull, gray overcast. I was shaking, more from the adrenaline than the cold, but I couldn't explain any of it to him. How could I? He'd think I was losing it. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I hadn't. The following days were a blur. I tried to push the events of that night out of my mind, but the image of that blood-stained shirt kept haunting me, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Toby standing there in the doorway, watching me leave. I finally decided to call the local police to ask if there had been any reports from the motel. They checked, but there was nothing. No suspicious activity. No missing persons. Nothing. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew better. Something had happened at that motel, something dark. And as much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Toby, and the motel worker, whoever he was, had been involved in something far worse than just a late-night scare. The experience changed me. I've never trusted strangers the same way since. Every time I pass a motel on the side of a lonely road, I think about that night. And I wonder, who else has checked in and never checked out? It was one of those nights when the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the winding roads of Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. The trees loomed like dark sentinels on either side, their branches reaching out as if trying to grasp at passing cars. I had been driving for hours, my thoughts swirling as I navigated the desolate stretches of asphalt. The radio buzzed softly in the background, but nothing could pierce the silence that had settled around me. As the clock ticked past midnight, the exhaustion began to seep into my bones. I felt the weight of solitude pressing down, the kind that comes from being the only car on a long stretch of road. My eyes flickered toward the gas gauge, and I realized it was time to refuel before I found myself stranded in the middle of nowhere. Just ahead, I spotted a small gas station, its flickering lights beckoning like a lighthouse in a storm. I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under my tires as I parked beside an old pickup truck. The vehicle looked like it had seen better days, with rust creeping along the edges and a battered paint job that hinted at countless journeys through rough terrain. An older man was seated in the driver's seat, his face obscured by shadows. He seemed lost in thought, staring blankly ahead. I felt an odd chill as I climbed out of my car, the cool night air wrapping around me like a shroud. After filling up my tank, I noticed the man had emerged from his truck and was now standing near the entrance of the station. He watched me intently, his gaze lingering a little too long. There was something unsettling about the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, as if he were waiting for the right moment to approach me. I tried to shake off the discomfort, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. With my heart racing slightly, I made my way back to my car, my eyes darting toward the man who was now walking toward the rear of his truck. I fumbled with my keys, eager to get inside the safety of my vehicle. As I slid into the driver's seat, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The man was still watching me, a faint smirk crossing his lips. I quickly turned away, trying to shake the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. After a few deep breaths, I pulled out of the gas station and back onto the winding road. The glow of the gas station faded behind me, but the sensation of being watched lingered. I tried to focus on the road ahead, the headlights illuminating the dark stretch before me. I could hear the soft hum of the tires against the asphalt, but it did little to calm my nerves. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their shadows shifting as if they were alive. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard a sudden thump. My car jolted violently, and I felt an unsettling vibration beneath me. Panic surged through me as I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart racing. I stepped out, my pulse quickening as I inspected the tires. My worst fears were confirmed when I saw the rear tire, completely flat, the rubber torn and shredded as if something had sliced through it. I knelt beside the tire, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "That's odd," I muttered to myself. "Who would do this?" My mind raced back to the old pickup truck at the gas station. Could it be that the man had followed me and slashed my tire? A knot of fear twisted in my stomach. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the line. I need help. I think someone slashed my tire. I'm on Route 322, just outside of Clearfield. I stammered, my voice trembling. Stay on the line, ma'am. We'll send someone out as quickly as possible, the operator assured me. I hung up, glancing around the desolate stretch of road. It was just me and the trees, their branches swaying ominously in the night breeze. With my heart pounding in my chest, I decided it was best to move away from the road and hide among the trees. I sprinted into the woods, my breath ragged as I stumbled over roots and underbrush. I found a small clearing, shrouded in darkness, and crouched behind a large tree. My heart raced as I waited, straining to hear any sound that might indicate someone was approaching. The stillness of the night felt suffocating, and the weight of fear pressed down on me. I could feel the cold ground beneath me, a stark reminder of my vulnerability. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Just when I thought I might be alone, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine revving nearby. I peered through the foliage, my heart pounding as I caught sight of headlights illuminating the dark path. The old pickup truck rolled into view, its engine growling as it came to a stop not far from where I was hiding. My breath hitched in my throat as I watched the driver emerge. It was the same man from the gas station, his figure silhouetted against the pale light. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the area, and for a moment, I thought he might have seen me. My heart raced as he fished out his phone and began talking, his voice low and menacing. "Yeah, I'm here now," he said, glancing around as if he was trying to locate me. "I didn't think she'd stop. She's more clever than I thought." Chills crawled down my spine as I realized he was fabricating a story to someone on the other end of the line. The very air around me felt charged with danger. I knew I had to remain silent, to keep still and not give away my position. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I knew that would be futile. As I crouched there, shivering in the darkness, I felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on my shoulders. I was not just a victim. I was a witness to something sinister. I could hear the man's voice growing more animated, and it filled me with a sense of dread. "Yeah, she stopped for gas. Didn't see it coming. "I'll deal with her," he said, a cruel smile evident in his tone. Panic surged within me. I had to get out of there. I peered back through the trees, praying that the sound of my racing heart wasn't audible in the stillness. Just then, I heard the distant sound of another car approaching. My breath caught in my throat as I watched headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the scene with an almost blinding light. As the headlights approached, I felt a surge of hope mixed with a deep-seated fear. Who was in that car? Would they be able to help me, or would they fall victim to the same fate I feared? I held my breath as the vehicle pulled into view, a silver sedan that came to a stop a short distance away. The driver's door swung open, and a young woman stepped out, her hair cascading down her shoulders, illuminated by the car's headlights. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" she called, her voice carrying through the stillness of the night. The man by the pickup truck glanced up, his demeanor shifting in an instant. I could see the tension in his body as he straightened up, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "No, it's just me," he called back, his tone deceptively friendly. "I'm just having some trouble with my truck. Can you help me?" The woman hesitated, glancing toward the darkened woods where I was hidden. I desperately wanted to shout to her, to warn her about the danger lurking nearby, but I couldn't risk revealing my location. Sure. What's wrong?" she asked cautiously, stepping closer to the edge of the road. "Just a flat tire," the man replied, his voice smooth like honey, masking the venom that lay beneath. "I could really use some assistance. I think I might have tools in my truck." My heart raced as I watched the scene unfold. The woman seemed hesitant, glancing around nervously as if sensing the tension in the air. I wished more than anything I could reach out to her, to pull her back before it was too late. Just then, the man's gaze flickered back to the woods, a knowing look crossing his face. "You're not alone out there, are you?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock concern. My blood ran cold as I realized he was trying to lure her in. I held my breath, feeling the weight of dread settle heavily in my chest. I could see the woman's confidence wavering as she hesitated, glancing back at her car. I was just passing through," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't really help with the tire, but maybe I could call someone for you." Before I could process what was happening, I decided to take a chance. I stepped out from behind the tree, my heart pounding as I emerged into the faint light. "Don't help him!" I shouted, the urgency in my voice echoing through the stillness. "He slashed my tire! He's dangerous!" The man's expression shifted instantly, anger flashing across his features as he turned toward me. "You don't know what you're talking about!" he yelled, his voice rising. "Get back in the woods, lady!" The woman's eyes widened in surprise as she turned to look at me. "What? Is this true?" "Yes." "Please call the police," I urged, my heart racing. "He's been following me. I think he wants to hurt us." The man took a step toward me, his body tense with rage. "You're making a mistake," he shouted, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I could feel the fear clawing at my insides, but I stood my ground, refusing to back down. The woman took a step closer to me, her expression shifting from confusion to determination. "Get away from her!" she shouted, her voice growing stronger. Just then, the sound of sirens pierced the night air, a distant wail growing louder as the police car approached. The man's eyes widened in realization, and for a split second, I thought he might bolt. But instead, he seemed to compose himself, adopting an air of innocence that sent chills down my spine. "Officers! I think these women are in trouble," he called out, gesturing toward us with a feigned look of concern. The police car screeched to a halt, the flashing lights illuminating the dark scene. The two officers emerged, their expressions serious as they approached. "What's going on here?" one of them barked, glancing between us and the man. "He slashed my tire!" I exclaimed, pointing an accusatory finger at the man. "He followed me from the gas station." The man immediately turned on the charm, a disarming smile plastered on his face. "I was just trying to help," he insisted. "I've been having trouble with my truck, and I thought they could lend me a hand. I never intended to hurt anyone." The officers exchanged skeptical glances, clearly not convinced. "Let's get your side of the story first," one of them said, motioning for me to step forward. I took a deep breath, pouring out everything that had happened: the flat tire, the gas station encounter, hiding in the woods, and the man's menacing demeanor. The officers listened intently, jotting down notes as I spoke. Meanwhile, the man stood to the side, his expression shifting from faint concern to barely concealed anger. I could see him glancing back at the woman, who had now moved closer to me, clearly shaken by the whole situation. After I finished my account, one of the officers turned to the man, his tone stern. "Can you explain why you were lurking around here at this hour?" "I was just minding my own business," he said, his voice dripping with false innocence. "I've had a rough night too, officer. I didn't do anything wrong." "Yeah, we'll see about that," the officer replied, his expression skeptical. He gestured to his partner to stay with the man while he walked over to the woman and me. "Are you both okay? Did he harm you in any way?" We both nodded, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins as I realized just how close I had come to a much darker fate. "I think we should check his truck," the officer said, his voice serious. "If he's been up to no good, we'll find evidence." As the officers approached the man's pickup truck, my stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and anticipation. I watched closely as the officer opened the door, the sound of metal creaking echoing in the stillness. "Let's see what we have here," he muttered, rummaging through the cluttered interior. I held my breath, praying that the truth would come to light. But just as I thought they might uncover something incriminating, the man's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he suddenly turned to the officers, a deceptive calm washing over him. "You're wasting your time," he said, a smirk on his lips. "I didn't do anything wrong. You can't arrest me without evidence." The officers exchanged glances, frustration evident on their faces. Just then, the second officer called out, "Hey, come look at this." We all turned to see him pulling something from the back of the truck, a long, jagged knife that gleamed ominously in the moonlight. My heart dropped as I locked eyes with the man. His expression morphed into a snarl, and I realized that the game had changed. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion as the officer held the knife aloft, its blade glinting in the police lights. The man's demeanor shifted from confident to desperate, panic flooding his face. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice rising in pitch. "You have no idea what you're doing." The officers moved quickly, closing in on him as he backed away, hands raised defensively. "I didn't do anything wrong," he protested, his voice growing frantic. "You're making a mistake." "Stop right there," one of the officers commanded, taking a step closer. "You're under arrest." The man's eyes darted around as if searching for an escape. I could see the realization dawning on him that the facade was shattering. He lunged suddenly, trying to bolt into the woods, but the officers were quicker. One of them tackled him to the ground, the sound of bodies colliding echoing through the night. The woman and I exchanged a wide-eyed glance, our hearts racing as the chaos unfolded. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as the officer cuffed the man, reading him his rights. It was a surreal moment, the culmination of everything that had just transpired. As the officer secured the man and led him to the police car, I felt a mix of gratitude and disbelief. It seemed unfathomable that I had escaped such a dangerous encounter. The woman turned to me, her expression one of shock. "I can't believe you stepped out like that," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved my life." "No, we saved each other," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "Thank you for stopping. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." The officer who had been speaking to us approached, his demeanor calm yet serious. "We'll need both of your statements for the report," he said, gesturing toward a nearby area where we could sit down. As we moved away from the chaos, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. The night had started so innocently, but it had quickly spiraled into a nightmare. I recounted the events to the officer, detailing everything from my encounter at the gas station to my decision to hide in the woods. Once we finished, the officer assured us that we would be safe and that they would be investigating the man thoroughly. "He has a history of criminal behavior," he mentioned, his tone grave. "You both did the right thing by reporting him." As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving me with a bone-deep weariness. The woman, who had introduced herself as Kayla, sat beside me, her expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "I can't believe this happened," she said, shaking her head. "It's like something out of a horror movie." "Yeah," I replied, my mind racing as I recalled the man's threatening demeanor and the darkness that had enveloped us. "I'm just grateful we both made it out alive." Eventually, the officers finished up, and I could see the man being led away, his face a mask of fury and frustration. It felt surreal to watch him being taken into custody, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. As Kayla and I waited for the tow truck to arrive, we exchanged stories, both of us still reeling from the encounter. We learned that she was a college student, driving home after a late study session. The world felt a little less daunting as we shared our experiences, a bond formed in the face of adversity. When the tow truck arrived, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a lingering fear that I couldn't quite shake off. As my car was loaded onto the flatbed, I knew I wouldn't be driving alone on these roads again anytime soon. Kayla and I exchanged numbers before parting ways, promising to stay in touch. I watched as she drove off, feeling a sense of camaraderie that only those who have faced danger together could understand. As I climbed into the tow truck and we headed back toward town, I couldn't help but glance back at the darkened woods. A chill ran down my spine as I thought of the man who had tried to turn my peaceful drive into a nightmare. Later, I would learn that the police had discovered even more disturbing evidence in the man's truck, a collection of weapons and items that suggested he had been stalking victims for some time. The knowledge made my skin crawl, and I felt fortunate to have escaped before things escalated further. In the end, the night had changed me. I had faced my fears and emerged stronger, but I knew that the shadows of that encounter would linger. I would always remember the lesson learned on that fateful night: never take safety for granted, and always trust your instincts. I never believed in the supernatural. In fact, I always scoffed at the idea. But what happened to me on that long, lonely drive from New York to North Carolina made me question everything I once thought was rational. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't hallucinating. Something happened to me that night, something that still chills me to my core. It all started with a job interview. Well, two, actually. I had been on the hunt for months after being laid off from my last job. Money was tight, and time was running out. A week earlier, I had received 2 callbacks for interviews, one in Charlotte and the other in Raleigh. Both were scheduled within 2 days of each other, and both could potentially be life-changing opportunities. I had no choice but to make the trip. Flying was out of the question. I couldn't afford a ticket, and even though I wasn't thrilled about the idea of driving 10 hours straight, it seemed like the only option. So, on a chilly November morning, I packed my bags, filled up my tank, and hit the road. I figured I'd leave early, drive all day, stop somewhere for the night, and finish the trip the next morning. Simple enough. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. I cranked up my playlist, kept my eyes on the road, and tried not to think too much about how much was riding on these interviews. The miles rolled by in a blur of highways, gas stations, and the occasional fast food stop. I was making good time, but as the day wore on, I began to feel the fatigue setting in. My hands gripped the wheel a little tighter, and my eyelids felt heavier with every passing mile. It was around 11 p.m. when things started to get strange. I had just crossed into Virginia, and the highway was nearly empty. It was one of those long, dark stretches of road where the only light comes from your headlights and the occasional street lamp. The sky was a blanket of thick, black clouds, and there wasn't a star in sight. I remember glancing at the clock and calculating how much longer I had before I could stop for the night. About 2 more hours, I thought, maybe less if I pushed it. That's when I saw him. At first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. I was driving at a decent speed, and in the distance, standing by the side of the road, was a figure. As I got closer, the shape became clearer. A man, dressed in a dark suit, standing perfectly still, facing the highway. He wasn't trying to hitchhike, nor did he seem to be in distress. He was just standing there, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. My heart rate spiked as I passed him. There was something unsettling about the way he stood, so rigid and expressionless. His face was obscured by shadows, but the outline of his form was unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. It was late, I was tired, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. But then I saw him again. Not even 15 minutes later, there he was, standing on the side of the highway, the same dark suit, the same stillness. This time, I was sure it was the same man. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me, not at the speed I was going. My stomach twisted into knots, and I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I pressed the gas a little harder, willing myself to stay focused on the road. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself. "You're just tired." But my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me as I sped away. By the time I reached the next rest stop, my nerves were shot. I needed a break, some coffee, maybe, just to shake off the eerie feeling that had been clinging to me since that second sighting. The rest area was small, dimly lit, and nearly deserted. I parked my car and made my way inside the convenience store, hoping the fluorescent lights and the hum of the coffee machine would snap me out of whatever fog I was in. As I poured myself a cup, I felt it again, that creeping sensation, like someone was watching me. I turned slowly, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing under the single flickering streetlight outside the store, was the man in the suit. He was just standing there, still as a statue, his face obscured by the shadows once again. My hand trembled, spilling some coffee onto the counter as I quickly turned back around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This was not normal. This couldn't just be in my head. I wasn't imagining him, I knew it. Without thinking, I left the coffee, rushed to my car, and locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. The rest area was dead silent, the only sound the low hum of my car's engine as I sped out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement. I drove for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was probably no more than 20 minutes before exhaustion caught up to me. The adrenaline from seeing the man had worn off, leaving me even more drained than before. My eyes were heavy, and every blink seemed to last a second too long. I knew I had to stop, had to rest, even if it was just for a few minutes. So, I pulled off into a random parking lot at some closed-down diner on the side of the road, reclined my seat, and closed my eyes. That's when the nightmare began. It wasn't just a dream, it felt too real. I was in my car, just as I had been before I fell asleep, but something was off. I could feel someone's presence. Slowly, hesitantly, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And there he was, the man in the suit, sitting in my back seat, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It took me a few seconds to realize where I was, that I was still in my car, alone. There was no one in the back seat. But the fear, the absolute terror I felt in that moment, lingered. And somehow, I knew that this wasn't over. When I woke up, it was still dark outside. My body felt stiff from sleeping in the car, but the adrenaline from that nightmare was still pumping through my veins, keeping me on edge. I sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, glancing in the rearview mirror over and over again, half expecting to see him, the man in the suit, still sitting there, watching me. But the back seat was empty. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. It had to be, right? There was no way someone had actually been in my car. But the memory of his eyes, cold, vacant, like they were staring straight through me, refused to leave my mind. I shuddered just thinking about it. I checked the time. 4:30 a.m. I was supposed to be in Charlotte by noon for my first interview, but now I wasn't sure if I could go on like this. I needed sleep, real sleep, or I'd never make it. But the thought of closing my eyes again, even for a second, made my stomach turn. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for me. I started the car and pulled back onto the highway, telling myself I'd find a proper motel soon, somewhere I could crash for a couple of hours before continuing. The road was quiet, empty except for the occasional truck that rumbled past me. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to the man in the suit. What was he? Why did I keep seeing him? And why the hell did he look so familiar? The sky was beginning to lighten by the time I spotted a small roadside motel. It looked rundown, the kind of place you'd only stop at if you had no other options. But at that point I didn't care. I needed to rest, even if it was just for a couple of hours. I pulled into the parking lot and checked in with the tired-looking woman at the front desk, who barely glanced at me before handing me a key. Room 7. I parked my car right outside and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, but the bed seemed inviting enough. I collapsed onto it, still fully dressed, and closed my eyes. Sleep came quickly, but it wasn't peaceful. I was back in my car, driving down the same dark stretch of highway. Everything was eerily silent. No music, no engine noise, just the soft hum of the tires on the asphalt. The road stretched out endlessly before me, and there was nothing around except the faint glow of the moon, partially hidden by thick clouds. Then, in the distance, I saw him again. The man in the suit, standing on the side of the road, just like before. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't stop the car. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, trying to outrun him, but no matter how fast I went, he seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly, he was right in front of me, standing in the middle of the road. I swerved, trying to avoid him, but the car spun out of control. I could feel the tires screeching against the pavement, the whole world turning upside down as the car flipped over and over again. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign outside. My heart was racing, and I could barely catch my breath. I glanced at the clock. 6 a.m. I had slept for barely an hour. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the dream. But something felt wrong. The air in the room was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast, echoing in my ears. And then I heard it. A soft creak, like someone shifting their weight on the old wooden floor. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner of the room, where the shadows were the darkest. And there he was. The man in the suit, standing in the corner, his face hidden in the darkness, his body perfectly still. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel his presence, suffocating me with its intensity. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen in place. My body wouldn't listen to me, as if I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat louder and louder, until it was the only thing I could hear. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. The floor creaked again, louder this time, as he moved closer to me. My breath caught in my throat, my muscles tensing with fear. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. He took another step, and then another. With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I could feel him getting closer, his presence overwhelming, crushing me with its weight. And still, I couldn't move. He was almost at the foot of the bed now, close enough that I could see the outline of his face, the way the shadows clung to him like a second skin. His eyes were still hidden, but I could feel them on me, piercing through the darkness. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, staring at him as he stood at the foot of the bed. Time seemed to stretch out, each second an eternity. My mind was screaming at me to move, to do something, but my body refused to listen. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The room was empty again, the air still heavy but no longer suffocating. I could breathe again, but my heart was still racing, my body trembling from the sheer terror of what had just happened. I didn't sleep again that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see him, standing there in the shadows, waiting for me. I stayed in that bed, staring at the ceiling, until the first light of dawn finally broke through the window. By 7 a.m., I was back on the road, headed for my first interview in Charlotte. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, following me, watching me. Every shadow on the highway, every dark corner, felt like he was lurking, waiting for the right moment to show himself again. And I had a sinking feeling that he wasn't done with me yet. By the time I reached Charlotte, I was on the edge of breaking down. I had spent the last 2 hours on the highway, constantly checking my mirrors, expecting to see him, the man in the suit, standing on the side of the road again. But he never appeared. Still, the dread weighed heavily on me, like an invisible hand pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every mile felt like a marathon, and the further I drove, the deeper the sense of impending doom crept in. I pulled into the parking lot of the office building where my first interview was supposed to take place. It was a clean, modern structure, all glass and steel, reflecting the bright North Carolina morning sun. Under any other circumstances, I might have taken a moment to appreciate the contrast between the cold urban design and the warmth of the autumn leaves swirling in the breeze. But my mind was far from such peaceful observations. As I sat in the car, staring up at the building, my phone buzzed. A notification for the interview reminder popped up, 8:30 a.m. with Mr. Kane. The name gave me pause. Kane. For some reason, it stirred something in me, something unsettling. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. It was probably just my nerves, the lack of sleep playing tricks on me. I got out of the car, smoothed down my wrinkled clothes, and forced myself to walk toward the entrance. The lobby was cold, sleek, with polished marble floors and a minimalist design that made me feel even more out of place. A receptionist greeted me with a smile and directed me to the elevator. When the doors slid open, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the 14th floor. As the elevator began its ascent, I stared at my reflection in the stainless steel doors. My face was pale, my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, and the dark circles under my eyes made me look like a ghost of myself. I felt a sinking pit in my stomach, like something was about to go terribly wrong, but I couldn't place it. It was just a feeling. The elevator chimed, the doors slid open, and I stepped out into a long hallway lined with offices. The nameplates on the doors read like a list of faceless professionals: Anderson, Smith, Jacobs. I made my way to the end of the hall, where a door with the name Kane was etched into the frosted glass. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. "Come in," a voice called from inside, deep and commanding. I pushed the door open and froze. Sitting behind the large mahogany desk was a man in a dark suit. His back was to the window, so I could only make out the sharp lines of his jaw, the faint glint of his eyes in the shadowed office. But the way he sat, the way his suit fit him perfectly, every detail, it was all too familiar. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. My legs trembled as I took a step forward, and the man looked up at me. It was him. The man from the highway. The man from my nightmare. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding in my ears, my vision blurred around the edges. I was staring at the very man who had haunted me for the last 24 hours. And now he was sitting here, calmly, like nothing was wrong. "Please, have a seat," he said, his voice smooth and businesslike. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of that office, to leave this place and never look back. But something kept me there, rooted to the spot, as if his very presence had paralyzed me. Slowly, as if in a trance, I moved toward the chair and sat down. He smiled, just a small, polite smile, but there was something in his eyes. Something dark. Something knowing. "So," he began, flipping through a folder on his desk. You've had quite the career so far. Impressive. His words were casual, but I barely heard them. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could this be the same man? What was he doing here? Was I losing my mind? I forced myself to speak, my voice shaky. Mr. Kane, have we met before? He paused, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. No, he said slowly, his tone measured. I don't believe we have. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten. Are you sure? I feel like I've seen you somewhere. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. People often feel a sense of familiarity when they're under stress. It's quite common. But no, we've never met. His words should have reassured me, but they didn't. There was something in the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, that made my skin crawl. It was as if he knew exactly what I had been through, what I had seen. The interview continued, though I could barely focus on his questions. I answered automatically, my voice distant, my mind locked on the figure sitting across from me. The more I looked at him, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a coincidence. This was the same man, the one I had seen on the highway, in my dreams, standing at the foot of my bed. And then it hit me. I knew why he looked familiar. Not because I had seen him on the road, not because he had appeared in my nightmares, but because his face, his eyes, were eerily similar to someone else. My father, who had died 2 years ago. A wave of nausea swept over me, and I gripped the edges of the chair to steady myself. I hadn't thought about my father in months, but now the memories came flooding back. His funeral, the last conversation we had, the way he had always worn suits to work, just like the man in front of me. I must have gone pale because Mr. Kane suddenly stopped speaking. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low, almost concerned. I nodded quickly, but inside, I was unraveling. I had to get out of there. I'm sorry, I muttered, standing up too quickly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need to go. Mr. Kane stood as well, watching me closely. Are you sure you're all right? You don't look well. I'm fine, I said, barely able to get the words out. I just need some air. Without waiting for a response, I stumbled out of the office and down the hallway, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I pushed through the lobby doors and into the cold morning air, gasping for breath. The world felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I got into my car and drove, not caring where I was headed, just needing to put distance between myself and that office. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still with me, the man in the suit. I didn't go to the second interview. I didn't take the job. Instead, I drove straight back to New York, leaving everything behind. But even now, weeks later, I still see him. In the shadows of my apartment, in the reflection of store windows, standing on the side of the road when I drive at night. He's always there, watching, waiting. I don't know who or what he is, but I know one thing for sure. He's not done with me yet.